Aaron Lutzi, Second Nature Friday pod.
We made it 26 episodes in. How sick is that?
What are you doing this weekend, bro?
I'm preparing mentally, emotionally, physically for a little trip to Hawaii with the family, which sounds glorious, but anytime traveling with kids, just wow. Wish us luck, I guess, on a lengthy flight and just being out of routine for a week. Although honestly, this entire summer has been out of routine with camps and all that stuff, which you're on your way to having to deal with all this stuff too, man. Happy 2 years to your little guy.
Yeah, my son's second birthday was yesterday. You know all about the emergency pediatric dentist appointment that we experienced last weekend. We don't need to go into it with our audience here today, but definitely you and I are in the thick of fatherhood. But look at you, you're casually complaining about the fact that you're going to Hawaii with the family this weekend.
Yeah, next Friday we'll have more to talk about I'll be podding from Hawaii, so that'll be sick. I'm here
Okay.
for that.
All right. Well, and I will be on the precipice of flying to Europe next Friday. So maybe we could each have a frosty beverage in front of us as we record as what we're calling internally the bro pod on Friday. So I guess maybe a little inside baseball here. We've really enjoyed going to this 2-episode a week format, trying to do an interview on the midweek episode. This week's show with Jess Fiaschetti was so good. So to our listeners who skip the interview pod, make sure you go back and listen to Jess. Man, she's got so much to say about the PR business. And then the two of us just connecting for the bro pods on Friday to send everybody off into the weekend. But your boy's pinning on a race bib on Saturday. No big deal. I'm going to run a nice little local 50K before I head over to Europe for UTMB. This was a strategy I implemented, you'll remember, ahead of Western States this year, where I went to Austria to run a race so that I feel a little bit more comfortable sitting around and talking about running. You and I always espouse the value of being practitioners. So this is me being a practitioner before I go to Europe to be a talking head for a little bit, which I think we might talk about in today's episode.
Yeah, we definitely need to talk a little bit about content strategy. I got some ideas for you, and I think it'll be fun just to kind of dig into a little bit. I feel like all this stuff that we're working on, we kind of are in the rhythm now. I mean, we're 26 episodes into the podcast. Freetrail has been doing the live stream and the trailgating thing for quite a while now. And even with my stuff on Super Rider, like we've got our well-worn path of what we got to do. And maybe it's kind of fun to kind of shake things up every now and then, or at least take a step back from it. I've been working with some people on the side to help them with their content strategy and teaching them YouTube and all that stuff. And it's kind of fun to have a chance to just put a new lens on this stuff. So I've got some ideas for you, and I think it'll be a fun discussion.
Well, nobody's taught me more. So I'll give you a sense of what we're going to be up to at UTMB, and you can poke holes in it and provide feedback. But before we get to that, on my other show, the Freetrail podcast, last week, we released the recording from the Brandon Athlete panel at Trailcon, a panel that you were meant to be moderating, but you were too busy driving across the country with your son, working on your own mountain bike content. But as the person who's taught me everything that I know about athlete marketing and sports marketing, I know you had some feedback or just some takeaways that you wanted to talk about on the pod today.
Yeah, man, I had some notes that I want to share with you.
How did I do, man? As your alternate, how did I do moderating that panel?
You were great. Honestly, you had a lot of the background information that I wouldn't have had with those people. I mean, you referenced something with Sally, like, oh, this thing happened 10 years ago. I would not have had that depth of information about the people that you were talking to. And one of the things that really struck me about the conversation, with a few exceptions, most of the people on stage, you and I talk a lot about cross-pollination between sports. Like you're learning something from maybe a triathlete or from whoever. What's interesting is a lot of the people that were on that stage have kind of cross-pollinated business and sport in a way that we can fully appreciate. And I think that there's a lot to be said that when you have worked, like Sally said, she'd had 20 jobs before she was a professional athlete. And David, obviously from On, is working at On and also a professional runner. I think there's a lot to be said for having any job where you have to be on sort of both sides of the fence. and you have a better sense of what the other side of the team is looking for. And when I have conversations with potential sponsors, that's the first thing I'm asking, is trying to understand where they're coming from and what their goals are and how best we could build something together instead of just being this one-sided thing one way or the other. And so I think having a group of people that have that cross-pollination between business experience and being an athlete was really fascinating to get really detailed stuff. Even, Amelia being a lawyer for Apple, I think,
Mhm.
and then being an athlete. I mean, she brings such a different angle to being an athlete and some of the contract discussions and all the elements on that side. So I love the cross pollination that everybody kind of brought to that table. But one of the things that also stood out to me is that a lot of the conversation, and obviously you had an hour to talk to those people, and that pod or that discussion could have gone on for hours, I can imagine. What I want to see in the future, next year at Trailcon or whatever, is after the ink dries on the contract. So a lot of the discussion in that podcast was like, how do you select the right partner? How do you select the right athlete? What does partnership actually mean? And that's a really wonderful starting point for the discussion, to give people lots of context from both the brand side and the athlete side of what goes into this whole thing. Where I want to take that discussion next year at TrailCon, and where we could have a little bit of a discussion right now, is what happens after the ink dries. And I'd love to hear from you. What is it like after you ink a 3-year deal with something? What is your next step after you've said, hey, these guys are the perfect partner for me. We're going to be working together for a couple years. After the elation of signing a deal for money kind of wears off, what do you do next?
I was just gonna say a deep exhalation of relief that you have some job security for at least a few years. And I that is an over exaggeration, but honestly, I think that's what a lot of athletes feel, is just like, okay, I can continue to do my sport, the thing that I want to do, and I will have the backing of the brand and the security that I'll be able to afford my groceries, even if I don't have health insurance. I mean, that is the nature of trail running and the nature of outdoor sports for most people. Although we're seeing the professionalization of trail running, especially to the point where I know for a fact the top athletes, are making really solid livings now, which is great. But in terms of what happens after that, I mean, I think it does open up a new level of energy where you can just focus on your training, focus on your goals, not have to worry about the security of your contract, the security of your career, or if you need to update your LinkedIn and your resume and go look for a new job, right? I mean, that's really it. And you can't overstate also the fact that that is a contributor to performance, right? When you're not worried about the security of your job, you are able to perform at a higher level. And this is something I talked about on my other podcast this week with David and Megan Roche, of just like the mental part of performing at a high level, and just the weight that a lot of athletes feel during these contract negotiations and these contract seasons. And maybe counterintuitively, it can be even more stressful when you have multiple brands that you're speaking to simultaneously, because then you have the further stress of like, am I making the right decision for me in my career? And it's not always clear. And actually, this is something we can talk about with Matt Sharkey on who we're going to be recording with soon, and who I personally negotiated contracts with when I was with the North Face, in the same way that you and I worked together on my contracts with Red Bull. But yeah, I don't know. I think the next step is just, focus, buckle down, be a good athlete, and be work hard to make sure that that contract and that support is justified. I mean, that's something that I always took super seriously. But one thing I wanted to maybe double click on from the panel conversation too, that I'd love to get your response on, is the difference between building a career and building a business. And this is something that I sort of teed up to Sally, who's done a very good job. And typically with athletes, and this goes back to one of our early episodes with Rebecca Rush, right? First, you build a career in the sport where you are subsisting on the support of brands mostly. And eventually, if you do it right, you can transition in the later phases of your career to actually build a business and an asset for yourself that Sally has done so well. And this has kind of been a theme that we've talked about on the podcast at least a few times. But there is a difference between building a career and building a business. And that was one of the things that I wanted to reinforce on the panel.
Yeah, that's interesting because she definitely has a lot of offerings and a lot of stuff that she's putting together. I don't know if I necessarily agree that one comes after the other one because I think that especially in today's world there's so many things that you could be doing like running a podcast. You didn't need to be at a specific point in your career to be able to do that. In fact, Payson McElvin is doing a podcast and that was kind of his first offering, but he did that early on in his career and let the whole thing percolate to this point where it's now extremely interesting for him and is impacting his career. I don't know on the business side. I don't have a lot of the details there, but I think there are certain kinds of things that you probably wouldn't be able to build business wise until later in your career. There's that I think it was Ryan Holiday was like, if you want to write a best-selling book, you have to go have like an incredible life first.
Yeah.
And so I think having context when you're building out specific styles of business, absolutely having a career behind you is pretty helpful. But at the same time, I think it's kind of 50-50. There's a lot of stuff that you could be doing that would be contributing to the bottom line and giving you the momentum and cushion to build a business as well along the way. You don't have to wait until the end. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that I saw with athletes where I've unfortunately been in those meetings where you have to tell an athlete like, hey dude, party's over. We call it graduation at Red
Yeah.
Bull. We graduate an athlete. And not every athlete has plan B or the next step figured out where, that whole business thing. I think that that's the biggest mistake is that they're not prepared for that next stage. And they've been like, oh, once my career's over, then I'm going to do this thing. And that's the problem is that they are scrambling because they haven't figured it out. You, on the other hand, have built, Freetrail up to this point that no matter what, you already know what you're going to do for the next decade. That and of course, second nature. You're stuck with me. Uh, but a lot of athletes don't do that kind of stuff, and I
But
think I
that
think
is
the
the transition between me building a career and versus building a business. Unfortunately, my
absolutely.
business has ruined my athletic career, though. But it's all good, you know. One another thing that I thought was really cool that I think we should see more of from the brand side because professional athletes are inherently really hardworking and inquisitive people who are willing to make real sacrifices for long-term goals is providing more of an education and more like day-to-day transparency into the businesses of the brands that they work with. And I think a monthly or quarterly meeting with an athlete team or with individual athletes to just be like, hey guys, just so you know, this is where the business is at for our brand. These are the key initiatives that we're working on. Here's why we're working on these initiatives. Here's the products that we want to be talking about in the marketplace. Here's why these products are particularly impactful for the business and therefore to the health of your long-term contract with our brand. That kind of information is very rarely ever shared with the athletes and with the athlete team, but that type of education would also help with that transition between building a career versus building a business, because then those athletes, when they are graduated, would become like the perfect candidate to step into a role within the brand that they work with, whether it's in sports marketing or in product or whatever, or, would give them the education that they need to then be more successful when their competitive racing career comes to a close and when, they do need to be graduated out of the brand. They have some foundation of education that they can fall back on to build their own business or be valuable to a different business. Any comments on that?
Ab- Absolutely, and I've I've worked with brands that have definitely tried to do a fair bit of that to give a little peek behind the curtain. There's sometimes a push and pull of like we want this integration to be natural. And so if we tell an athlete, hey, make sure that you have a can in your hand every single time, then there's these sort of inauthentic moments where they're holding the can up or they're carrying it along in a moment where it wouldn't make sense. For example, it was awesome for us when you were at like an aid station smashing a Red Bull. That's authenticity at its core because you're using it the way it's meant to be used in like a really clutch moment. And then of course you go on to like win the race or whatever. That's like pretty sweet. But having somebody with like a closed, like an unopened can on a podium, for example, is like the worst thing ever. Where yeah, like if you tell the athlete what matters to us is that you always have a can in your hand, which is sort of the truth, but the athlete doesn't get the message 100% or they get it wrong. When it goes wrong, it's actually really bad
Mm.
from the brand perspective. And so, getting, I don't disagree because I think you have to like bring them along for the ride, but it's not like a one and done thing. It's like this constant evolution of really bringing them along for understanding that. But it sometimes feels like a game of telephone, specifically with athletes, where you'll say something and they'll take a version of it and it'll actually be worse
Mm.
than, than if you hadn't said anything at all. It's a really tricky thing. Not every athlete is as switched on as you are when it comes to this kind of stuff, and helping them understand that. And also from the perspective of an athlete who might have 10 sponsors, if they're all coming in and telling them, we need this, we need this, we need this, that mental strain that you're talking about is sort of part of that. One thing that I wanted to come back to from sort of the beginning of this conversation of after the ink dries is about advocating for yourself in that world, or advocating for the athlete that you sign. And I think that was the most important thing with our relationship at Red Bull, was being your advocate. And part of being the advocate was giving you a little bit of the inside baseball of, hey, this is like what people kind of care about. And if you could lean in on this, it would probably help you and help me help you.
Yeah.
Super important to be able to get those messages across and be specific with it. But I think also thinking about what is the best thing to advocate. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how it was really stressful for you before the contract was signed, because actually that window was setting me up for, and you up for, more success down the line, because I was talking to you about like what your goals were, what your vision was, what kind of stuff was interesting to you, where you wanted to go, what projects, what races. And that was information gathering on my part so that when the ink dried, I could start pitching projects internally to put you in the right place to be even more successful and valuable to the brand. And so, this information gathering time while we're sort of working out the contract details in the background was arguably the most valuable window. But it's funny to hear you say that that was actually the most stressful window. Thoughts?
Well, because you don't know that it's official until you actually sign the contract, and
Yeah.
at least for me, I'm a very fear-driven person, and I think inherently paranoid, and so when it's not official, you can't really bank on that it's actually that you're gonna close the deal, right? And
Yeah.
so there's inherent fear attached to that. But you just touched on something I thought was interesting also from this panel from Robert Mook, who's the global head of sports marketing for Adidas Terex, who said that he prefers a mono-branded athlete for
Yeah.
the reason that you just articulated. It's like if you have 10 sponsors, you're telling so many different stories that you end up diluting, many, if not all of your sponsor relationships. And so that's an inherent tension in the space too, because I hadn't really fully thought about that or internalized that personally. But it is true, I think, right? Like then your personal channels become more cluttered with things that look like advertisement. Whereas if you're mono branded, you have a cleaner ability to advocate for your brand partners, though you also limit your income capability. And so for Robert, it'd be interesting if we gave him a truth serum about like how much extra would you pay to prevent an athlete from engaging additional sponsors. And he even used the example of Toyota. Like there was an athlete who was Adidas, Terex, and Toyota, and a couple of others that I can't remember. And that it just makes it a cluttered story to tell when you're an athlete. It maybe dilutes the power of the Adidas Terex contract. Anyway, I thought that was interesting.
How do you think about that as an athlete in the situation too? Like, as you're going through contract negotiations, is it just like wherever the chips fall in the conversations you're having that year, and that's what you end up with? Are you aiming at a specific number of like, I need to make X amount this year? I mean, I'm guessing a Toyota deal was probably a pretty healthy deal from whoever athlete got that.
Actually, I have a good example, a practical example here. So when I got my Red Bull contract from you, buddy, I was already with the North Face. So I had to go ask permission. Hey, can I sign this headwear deal with Red Bull? And the North Face said yes, so long as we can have your pack real estate. So a hydration pack. And at the time, I was with Camelback. In fact, I was Camelback's first ever paid trail athlete, I think. And the North Face didn't really have a mass produced hydration pack product at the time. So I said, yes, I will, leave Camelback and start, with the North Face, but we have to work on developing a pack together, which we ultimately did. And it was my first real opportunity to work on collaborating in product development with a brand also. And I think that was still to this day North Face best hydration pack product. And anyway, an interesting, back and forth with the brand. I'm like, okay, we're losing your head real estate. Well, we want your pack then. And, then it is all about like finding what works for everybody, right?
Yeah, and I've got to imagine North Face, to a certain extent, understood the value of the Red Bull partnership wasn't just the headspace, but it was the increased visibility that you were going to get, and by proxy, they were going to get. And so you were bringing value back to the North Face, even though you were kind of switching out a piece of branding to, make it work.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately all parties kind of succeeded. But we could ask Max Sharkey about that, how he thinks, because he was on the other side of that discussion. And
I think that was
uh,
before his time, but we do have a good story with Sharky about a negotiation that took place around Christmas, like at the 11th hour, trying to get contracts done before the end of the year. But we'll save that
amazing.
for a future pod. But anyway,
Yeah.
that was my favorite panel of Trailcon. Just really fun and transparent and back and forth in a way that I don't know. I felt like it could have gone on for multiple hours and we would have had significantly more amazing conversation to explore together. So that's a to be continued with Aaron Lutzi at Trailcon 2025. But
I'm excited for it. I mean, I definitely want to really push past, and speak about how to build activations, how to build the partnership. Like, how do you take this contract and then stack and stack and stack and make this athlete something that identifies with the brand? Like the idea of the mono brand athlete, I get that, but you can't just be like, well, they're branded head to toe. It's like, well, yes, but the storytelling with them and the projects we do, the activations we do with that athlete, that's where the actual value comes, not from the fact that you can't wear anything else but
yeah,
Adidas. It's that we are doing lots of stuff that identifies the two of us together. Without that, you can wear whatever you want, in my opinion. I think you have to have the actual activation, and that's where that next step, that ideation, that understanding of the projects and the
mm,
value and the media, that I would love to just really dive into that next year on the panel. And that's sort of my focus. So hopefully that's okay.
okay, cool. And we got to do our contract season concept that we brainstormed together at the end of last year. So
Yeah. I think I'm actually thinking maybe this is like a course that we could share, where we can take somebody through not only understanding what goes into that discussion, but building out their proposal, understanding what's valuable in a proposal, and really rounding out this entire thing. If you're an athlete that wants to get to this point, but if you're a brand that wants to find athletes, like I think there's two different sides of it that could be really interesting to kind of share input on, and help people get to that next
Yeah,
level. I don't know.
absolutely. Two courses, one for athletes, one for sports marketers. If you are a listener to Second Nature and you're interested in potentially taking one of those courses, hit us up on Instagram, secondnature.media. The next topic you wanted to talk about is UTMB, where your boy is going to be heading next weekend. What do you want to know?
I want to know. I know you've done trail gating at other events. The Western States one with UTMB was really cool, and you've got like tons of talent in there. I would love to hear from you. UTMB is obviously a massive. It's like the Super Bowl of ultra running. I want to hear from you. What do you think the job is to be done at UTMB with your content in total, from the second you get there until the second you leave? What do you actually want that content to achieve?
The whole vision for Freetrail from the beginning was to bring professional level coverage of the competitive end of the race to a global audience, right? To bring the ESPN analysis and commentary of trail running to a sport that was rapidly professionalizing, but I felt lacked any context and color to create new trail fans. And so that's what I try and do with my podcast and with our race activations and the coverage that we do is contextualize the professional athletes, the professional races, what's happening, why is it happening that way, and help people become fans of those athletes and become fans of professional trail running in general. So that's where the trailgating concept was also born too. The model and the inspiration was take college game day for college football and bring it to trail running, right? Like just building the hype, having the, informed analysis, predictions, prognostication, all that fun stuff that's present in a lot of other sports that are more mature and developed than ours, and see what happens. Can we develop diehard trail running fans? And, my other inspiration is Breakfast from Wimbledon, something I've been watching since I was a kid. I always loved Wimbledon, and every day they have a couple of anchors who sit and they have highlights of matches that have taken place, and then the experts will tell you why it matters and how does this impact the draw and the tournament as a whole, and which athletes are dealing with injury, which athletes are coming in with some momentum, all that type of information that sports fans love. And I think for me, as a lifelong consumer of sports media and fan of sports of all different types, I'm also just as much a fan of the pre and post race coverage as I am of the races or competitions or games themselves. I just love that stuff. And so that's always been the inspiration for the trailgating coverage that we do is, we are the pre and post race contextualizing, information sharing, entertainment, and education for trail fans, right? And so that's what we'll be doing at UTMB in the same way that we did around Western States, which we talked about is just doing a daily show where there's races happening all week. We'll be doing athlete interviews. We'll be, providing our commentary about races as they go down, contextualize those stories for a global audience and hopefully bring the story of the 2024 UTMB to more people in a way that will create more trail fans.
Perfect. Global audience. I love this. The accessibility of the sport is what we absolutely should key in on, because I think the X's and O's of, the pre and post race stuff, you guys have that down to a science. You know the history, the athletes. You can open the door for some really deep conversations that people who are, I always love talking about the funnel, top of funnel, bottom of funnel. People in the bottom of the funnel are like eating that up. And I think that you've nailed the hardcore fans of trail running. You're giving them like the absolute catnip for what they need,
Yeah.
right? When you think about the top of the funnel, you think about this global audience and how to get more people into the sport. I wonder, and maybe you've done this as an exercise. Have you ever sat down during College Game Day or any of the more popular, ESPN TV shows and dissected the different segments that comprise the show? Because a lot of College Game Day, a lot of I'm blanking on the names of like the top ESPN shows, but a lot of their formats are just a lot of short form pieces crammed together. They'll do like a rundown of like these 5 topics or a this or that, overrated, underrated. And I think that there's a lot to take from, TV has been A/B tested like crazy.
Mhm.
What's working, what's not working. And I think that what these global audience based channels are doing for mainstream sports is giving anyone a chance to access these sports, whether they like them or not. I don't necessarily care about football, but I can watch this show and pick up a tidbit that might be a piece of trivia that I call on a year or two from now. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to think about trail running in the same way, where you might think about how to offer up these tidbits of information, because to access the information that they currently need to learn, they have to sit through an hour-long podcast where they might not know the person that's being interviewed. I know like 10 ultra runners, and I've spent a lot of time with you, and I've listened to a lot of Freetrail, and I've watched a lot of coverage. But for someone who hasn't done any of that, they don't know anybody. They know, David Goggins, who's definitely not at UTMB.
Yeah.
That's about it. And so I think that there's this opportunity to n- like, it's exhausting to think about like, oh, you know what you should do at UTMB? Make a bunch of short form content. That's exhausting because it's like you, Harmony, and
Yeah.
Ryan just like handling
It's
it.
actually just
But
Ryan and I this year. Harmo's not
oh
coming.
no, oh no. Well, in that
We
case,
might have some extra help.
let me tee up an idea. And I think this kind of goes back to the College Game Day. What if you were able to pull in some of the formats that work really well in these TV shows into the podcast itself? And I've
Example,
seen that.
please.
So what if play I'll call it a game with whoever's in there, right? So overrated, underrated, speaking about training specifically, like what were the things in your training that worked and didn't work? Or what are, having them go through and have like a quick fire thing.
Yeah.
So you could have that as part of the podcast. That would be like interesting and fun for the people that were listening to the hour-long one, but it would be easy to clip that out and be like, great, here it is, overrated, underrated. Um, I think that you could do bits where like you ask a question pointedly that's like, what would be one tip that you would share with people trying to get into ultra running?
Yeah.
Maybe it doesn't fit in the context of the pre-post thing, but what if there were 3 or 4 questions that you could ask after the interview or before the interview, just as you're kind of like, get the ball rolling, that could be easily clipped for a short form piece of
And
content.
you're saying the
So
value of this is just more top of funnel,
yeah, yeah.
reaching people who are not core endemic trail consumers.
But might be
You know, this is
interested in
something
it.
that we've always sucked at, and that I've always sucked at personally, is like doing the top of funnel stuff, which I think has been good because we've been able to build our business in a way that's made us resilient, in that we have an engaged audience of people who are hardcore fans, but we don't do a lot to reach out to new audiences. I guess
Mhm.
that's kind of what you're getting after there.
That's what you got me
Yeah.
for. I think that you could do a lot for the athletes too. One other way that word of mouth grows in mainstream sports is through trading cards, which is like, oh, that's interesting. But what if you could make sort of like a short form trading card where it's like you make a 45-second clip that's like, this is Jim Walmsley and this is why he's important. Like you said the phrase,
Dude, I love that.
you were talking about why it matters, right?
Yeah.
So imagine, like, could you write 3 sentences on why Courtney Dauwalter matters? Could you write 3 sentences on why UTMB matters?
100%.
Why Jim? And that's your script for the thing. Now that's going to take a little bit more editing to put the pieces together and get the voiceover or whatever. But could you tie somebody in like, this is why this guy is the GOAT of ultra running. This is why she is the greatest 100 miler to exist. This person is like the hottest up and coming. That's like, you're talking about why it matters to a global audience, and you are sharing the answers to trivia
All
questions.
right, Lucy, book your trip to Geneva, flying out next Saturday. We'll see you there. I do love that as an idea, and that's something that would be squarely within my wheelhouse of just like throughout race week, if we could just cut 30-second clips of like, here's Jim Walmsley. He's one of the favorites. Here's what he's done this season. Here's why he's one of the best of all time. Bing, bang,
Mhm.
boom. Top of funnel, contextualization, and that it would feed down funnel to the longer form show
Yeah.
format. Am
This
I on
is
track here with the content strategy?
absolutely. I'll take a first class ticket to. But no, look, here's the thing though. Here, this is where I see every brand mess up when it comes to going to events. I'm not singling anyone out, but what Red Bull did really well when they'd have an event. Let's take what was the one where we had to run up the hill? We ran up the mountain in Salt Lake. Oh, Red Bull 400, where you run up the
Is
ski
that
jump.
dead now? That was such a
I,
good concept for a while.
I I love that
Yeah.
event. You crushed it, man. That was a
That
fun
was
one.
so hard.
Yeah. Uh, okay, so let's just use that as an example, right? It's a event where you have to run up a long jump ski rate. I don't even know what that's even called. It's like a ski jump, and it's in the summer, so there's no snow on it. You run up this like crazy steep 400-meter track. Every other brand, if they put on that event, would have filmed the experience and like, look at everybody running up the thing. So what? Why does it matter? Like, what's going on here? What's the actual story? Great. People ran up 400 meters and nearly died at the top. What Red Bull would do going into an event like that would be to sit back and be like, what are the 4 formats that we should shoot that would be interesting and related to this event that people who don't care about running would find interesting? And they went to the event with the formats pre-planned, with the structure of the video pre-planned, so that when they got to the event, it wasn't just like spray and pray, hose down the event with your phone and try to edit it afterwards. They knew, here's our shot list of what we need to get. Here are the prompts that we need to ask. Here are the things that we absolutely need to shoot. And then they'd come back and they'd have this amazing piece of content. And so many brands go into events, whether they're the title sponsor or they've got a booth at the event, they have no idea of the format of the content that they're going to create once they get there. It's very much this concept of spray and pray. Let's hope that we got something that's like sort of engaging or interesting, or even worse, we just have to film something at this event that we can post on our
Yeah.
socials. Ugh. No, you have to go into the event with formats in mind. And so this pre-planning is exactly why I wanted to like catch your attention on this whole thing before you go to UTMB. No pressure.
All right,
You got
buddy.
a small crew, but anytime you want, I'm on the
Are
flight.
you on the Big Island next week, or which island are you on?
We're staying in Honolulu.
All right. So are there
So
direct flights from Honolulu to Geneva? Because we're gonna need you. We're gonna need you on board one of those. Uh, well, hey, I love that as an idea, and that gives me some good food for thought. Honestly, I have felt like a little behind on the planning and preparation and programming for our shows, and we likely will have some extra help. It probably won't just be Ryan and I, and maybe that a good place for us to start is this idea of like the digital trading card of professional trail runners, because I think that is perfect, and it would also, like I said, it'd be upstream of being able to promote our shows, but also be able to promote our fantasy competitions, which is another thing that's kind of core to what Freetrail does, is that's also present in a lot of professional sports, of just like predictions and playing fantasy and engaging a fan in that type of a way. And a digital trading card would be a perfect way for us to say, okay, here's one of the favorites. Also, don't forget to go play fantasy.
yeah,
Very
I've
cool.
got two more. I've got two more things for you. Also, I personally, and I bet a lot of the audience would love to see some sort of BTS piece of content of your experience at that event.
Yeah.
So many people have this like rich experience with you on the podcast or on the live stream, but the behind the scenes of how this stuff comes together, the good and the bad of it, I think is a story worth telling. One thing that I'm seeing, and I saw a lot from the Olympics, people are running this dad cam thing where it's kind of like budget footage, but it's just like super POV, just like carrying it around dad cam style and then publishing that. And there's some value in just the raw, unpolished version. And I think, just like all the best videos on Freetrail are just stories. It's not necessarily a podcast, but it's the story itself
Yeah.
of the event. I think that would be a really interesting one.
You
It
know,
doesn't always
Solomon
need to
just
be.
published something like that from Hard Rock that was kind of filmed vlog style, and I
Yeah.
actually found it to be really engaging and entertaining in a way that a polished documentary isn't, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. One
The
more?
other last thing, mid form content. So we talked about short form content, and I have a bunch more format ideas. I'll text them to
Good
you
God, dude.
afterwards.
Like I need an AI transcript of this podcast because you're just absolutely taking me to school here publicly. Our audience is probably like, Jesus, Dylan's totally incompetent.
No, man. You know what?
What the
Actually,
hell is mid-form content?
well, okay, I'll go to mid form, then I want to go back to the short form thing. But mid form is you are covering a lot of topics. There are basically chapters in the conversation that you're having with these athletes, right? And again, going back to this point about we are trying to engage a global audience, tell them why it matters, really make this relevant to them and educate them on something. One thing that I see in a lot of the bigger podcasts is that they'll run the full long form piece of content, but then they'll pull out a relevant chapter and tee up that specific topic as, say, like an 8-minute piece that's a little bit easier to digest. And so, what you might also consider is like, what would be one piece of content, one chapter from each one of the trailgating where it's not titled as trailgating, it's titled as the topic that they're discussing, and you drop in the middle of that conversation, you give the audience that 8 minutes. It's easier to
So do you
digest.
post both of those? That's
Yeah, yeah, I would.
so you would just sort of like clutter your channel. You have one playlist that's the long form shows, and then you have obviously your shorts are top of funnel stuff, and then you also have a mid form playlist that is like what Jim Walmsley thinks about the Western States UTMB double, for example.
Yes,
Huh.
yeah, that piece of information, because I think that a lot of people would just click to see that. I'm one of those people where, like, I mean, and we see this on the Second Nature channel on YouTube, where it's a big commitment to lock in for an hour and watch a YouTube video.
Hmm.
But it's not that big of a commitment to watch an 8-minute video, especially if you know the topic that's going to be discussed in detail and it's somebody that you're following. I feel like that 7 to 8 minute window on a specific topic would actually be really interesting. We could actually test it. We could do something about, like, Aaron's content strategy for UTMB or something out of this podcast and just see
Oh, this is
which
perfect. Look at
which one.
this.
Let's A/B test this one, and then we'll put it out tomorrow. So then we'll get a chance to see. Now, the one thing I wouldn't do, I wouldn't put both of them out at the exact same time, and I would package them very differently. I would give them a little bit of breathing room. But I think that there's value in both, and I think that different people may look
See,
and
this
look.
is just
It's
like it sounds so good on paper. It's really hard to have a
yeah,
team that can do all of this,
yeah,
especially,
absolutely.
kind of working on tight budgets in foreign countries with so much shit going on all week.
What I think could be interesting is after the discussion happens, because you and I do this all the time. We're like, oh, that one part where we were talking about was really
Yeah.
interesting.
What if you pump the mid length, what do we call it? Mid form content
Yeah,
the week after.
yeah, that's exactly it.
Uh,
So write down after the thing, or make a note in like a notes app. Be like, hey, that one topic that we talked about with Walmsley was so perfect. And then when you get back and you're going through all the footage, pull that one chunk out and post that,
Damn. God, you got my
Yeah.
brain firing right now. I was reluctant to do this segment today, and now I'm like, holy shit, we got to close down. We got to close down the episode so that I can call Ryan and we totally revolutionize Freetrail strategy.
I
Uh,
mean, look, The one thing that I would say, especially for the short form stuff, is like the more you can plug it into your actual podcast, probably the better because A, if somebody gets excited about it, then it's an easy way to like send them to the full podcast. But B, it's an interesting way to just make this stuff super accessible to other people without having to do a lot of extra production work. And one of the places I actually saw this work really well, there's a YouTube educator by the name of John Ushai, and he does podcasts with famous YouTube creators. And a segment that he does in his podcast, it's a video podcast, and he does a segment that's like draw your income, how much you get from AdSense, from sponsors, from brand deals, from merch, from whatever. And that one piece is informative in the podcast, but it's the perfect piece of short form content. And so you kind of double dip a little bit when it comes to your content. You don't have to make everything fresh because that's just going to be way too much work for you and Ryan to do.
Okay. Geez. Awesome X's and O's of outdoor content creation. Hope that's valuable to our audience. Should we do this nostalgic culture segment?
Yeah.
Okay,
Let's
cool.
do
All
it.
right, let's
Yeah.
just do this quickly and then we can close with BPC. So this was something that I wanted to introduce into the docket at the 11th hour here. I saw a really interesting post on LinkedIn from a guy named Corey Malley, who I don't know personally, but it was a post that struck me as having a profound insight. Apparently, Corey is a brand and cultural strategist in the fashion, luxury, and streetwear space. He's got a business called Whatever Industries. And he put up a post about effectively the thesis is that art and culture are sort of stuck right now. Everything is a remake, everything is a throwback. There aren't any new original ideas. He uses the example of Robert Downey Jr. just getting another like huge contract to make the same movie that he's made a million times, and that every song is basically meant to hack the algorithm and be very streamable. And so there's a lack of originality out there. And I then reposted his post with my sort of hypothesis that some of this stems from the hostility of the information space and about how people are scared of criticism, and that maybe that is what's leading to a feeling of dullness and dilution of art and culture. And I got a very interesting DM from a guy who I used to know from the North Face, who I'm not going to name, but who maybe I could convince to come on the podcast in the future. We're going to catch up next week. But he sent me a really interesting DM. And if it's okay with you, I'm just going to read it and
Yeah.
have you respond. Okay.
Perfect.
So, what he says, and this is somebody who's very credible in this space, had a high level role at one of the biggest outdoor brands in the world. He says, this whole issue of craving stability and safety of the past and what that means for creativity and disruption is a massive issue that gets me fired up. And while he was focused on culture, fashion, entertainment, the phenomenon that Malley wrote about is a major limiter in the outdoor athletic space also. Honestly, I think it's one of the biggest reasons for TNF's current situation too. Not to point a finger at Nike, but I believe Nike's long-term success has actually been the limiter for many competing brands as well as Nike itself. A brand like TNF and VF as a bigger org can't help themselves. They aspire to have Nike success, and so they pursue Nike talent, believing that they can replicate that success. It's the stated reason why almost every major and minor footwear brand has set up a shop in Portland. We want to access all that talent. And while everyone knows it, executive teams, boards of directors, and middle managers alike quickly overlook the fact that Nike is an incredibly matrixed organization where people become very efficient at performing their role within a very narrow scope of responsibility and hire them for roles that require much more. That structure is great if you want to keep doing what you've been doing efficiently. But if you want to forge a new point of view or champion an underdog idea or concept, that's a different skill set and a different mindset. I see this happening with the up and coming brands right now. Shiny new offices in downtown Portland, growing like crazy and adding headcount all over the place. And it's a super safe play and probably an easy sell to their respective boards. But I don't believe that will reinforce the disruptive thinking that got them on the map in the first place. It will probably just guarantee status quo with a tiny hint of evolution. But in a world where publicly traded brands live quarter to quarter, it gets really hard to chart a course to what you want to be in 5, 7, or 10 years. Rant over. I hope you don't mind being the outlet for this one, especially since we haven't seen each other in years. Continued success to you. Yada, yada, yada. Anyway, I thought that was a really profound insight from this person of just like, that harkens back to what Corey Malley's point was of like everybody's trying is like we talk about the value of cross pollination, but maybe this is an example of like people looking for direction or ideas laterally instead of like truly focusing on coming up with something original and creative. And the example of everybody looking up to Nike for good reason, having been such a pioneering brand in the space, when the thing that made Nike Nike is the fact that they had originality and creativity that then created this culture and environment of excellence that ultimately resulted in it being the biggest performance brand in the world. Really, really interesting. And I know this is something that I'm sure you have thoughts on too.
I have so many thoughts. I think that that DM that you got is pretty spot on. I think that, data plays the biggest role now. I mean, if you think about when Nike started to now, data is such a big part of every piece of decision making. And of course, it makes sense that, well, this worked, it will probably work again. It just feels like a photocopier, and then you're making a copy of a copy, and then a copy of a copy of a copy. And you have to wonder about, people who have just joined Nike a couple years ago, now moving on to other stuff. They weren't part of that innovative cycle. They are the copy of the copy of the copy, unfortunately. Maybe there's something in the DNA at Nike that brought them there that's special and that they are still valuable. I'm not saying that they're not, but I think, yeah, people who have been in more of a maverick style brand, I love the anti brand people that are just like, I know that works and I could do that, but I'm going to go this way with it because this is true to me. And I think the authenticity that, people are trying to introduce. But yeah, it's a tough uphill battle. We talked about this on it. The irony is that we actually talked about the same thing already on episode 1 or 2 about stuck culture, because this is pervasive everywhere, because it is a deeper cultural thing of, we know this works, we're going to rinse and repeat. And unfortunately, one of the things on, a lot of the YouTube people that talk about like how to be successful is like, take your 5 most, best videos and then just remake that with a twist. And it's just like, ugh,
Yeah.
this is exhausting. It's just nobody's really coming up with original thought right now. And we have to find a way to reward people for doing something new and exciting. And when it does hit, it absolutely hits. A reason why lots of people are excited about Liquid Death, and for an example, is that it's just sort of shaking things up and it's
Great
fresh, and
example.
there's a lot of people really excited about it. A lot of people that maybe think, oh, this is maybe a little bit too stunty for me, and like, what's left after that. But I think ultimately, the fact that they are at least trying something new and are pushing in a new direction will hopefully inspire more people to do that. And whether you could leave even a place as innovative as Liquid Death and actually enact that level of change and shake up somewhere else is to be seen, right? Like, could you take somebody from Liquid Death and move them to an outdoor company, and would they have the same impact and would have the same outcome? I don't know. And the unknowing part is what makes it difficult and makes everybody revert to the center again.
Huh.
And I think a lot of people need to feel more comfortable taking chances, but also everybody's trying to survive. Like,
What do you think
it's
of?
tough out there.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, the same thing is going to happen with Liquid Death, right? Like everybody's going to start copying the way that they do marketing to the point where that's going to feel tired and commoditized. What do you think about this idea of the talent merry-go-round in Portland leading to the feeling of like commoditization of product and brand messaging? Because to me, it's like, well, geez, maybe then, the best way to create a new brand is to like do what Kyle's doing with Raid, right? Just set up shop in Carbondale, Colorado. Totally different. Obviously, he's a one-man shop right now in the very early phases, but you get what I'm saying.
I asked an on employee how much of their output right now was stuff that they could or that they learned from Nike and how much that they couldn't do at Nike that they were finally free to test out. I never got the right answer on, or I never got an answer on it, but I think that's a really interesting question to pose to a lot of people that have come from that world. Now, there are certain things that make a ton of sense. For example, if you were working at Red Bull Distribution Company, you have the tactics to be able to go to any other company that wants to have high level distribution and wants to break through on the sales side of thing, and you can impact that. So some of the hiring that some of these companies in Portland are doing, they may be just hiring tacticians that can help them boost sales, that can help them get through the doors at retailers and help them do the nuts and bolts stuff that they probably don't have on the ground that needs to exist. When it comes to the ideation, to the innovation, that's the part where I think a lot of brands would do well to cross pollinate, to look across, to find people in other industries that could bring something really interesting to them. Where are the non obvious places where there might actually be alignment? What if you brought somebody from, you know, an industrial design background, an animation background, a comic book background into this world of design? You know, how might they think about how this looks or how this feels or what might resonate or what might not? You know, when you and I think about our project, I think it shouldn't necessarily look like something that looks like it's part of the outdoor industry. It should suggest that but not be only that, you know.
Hmm.
And we should be more than just that. And so how might these brands also think similarly of how do we push beyond where we are and introduce a new look and feel and style? And maybe that's why, you know, those new on shoes that don't have laces were so interesting, because it just removed one of the things that everyone
Yeah, but
assumed
isn't
had to
that
be
a good
there.
example, right? Because in all likelihood, that was developed in Europe, not in Portland.
That's right.
So it's almost like Portland, in the same way that Silicon Valley is the global headquarters for the technology industry, Portland is kind of the global headquarters for the footwear and apparel industry. And maybe the big disruptors are going to be coming from outside those markets. Although in technology, that's not the case, right? You can point to Spotify being Swedish or Shopify being Canadian, but still all the biggest companies are being born out of Silicon Valley and the dearth of talent present here. So it's a tough conundrum, right? But I do think there's something about just the physical location of the brand that might be able to inform an original point of view that avoids this feeling of copy paste nostalgic things that worked in the past.
Hmm. Agreed.
So anyway, interesting place where we can close down, but I'm glad we were able to wedge that into today's episode, and maybe we can get the sender on the show here again. I'm going to catch up with him next week, so
Awesome.
very
That'll be a
excited
fun
about
one.
that. And I got product ideas I got to run past him that you and I have talked about. But anyway, should we close with BPC?
Let's do it.
Okay, you want me to get us started?
Go for
All
it.
right, sweet. All right, so this kind of goes back to this idea of growing trail running and maybe even like top of funnel stuff. Last weekend was Sierras and All, which is Europe's oldest trail race. It's like 50 years old. It's in Switzerland. It's basically the short distance Super Bowl in trail running. So where UTMB is the long distance kind of Super Bowl or Western States. This is a 30K, so about a 17-mile race in the Swiss Alps. And Killian won for the 10th time. I'm actually writing a newsletter about Killian right now for Freetrail, but um, my point is that the broadcast for it is fantastic. So this is my content for the week. The Golden Trail World Series put up the full broadcast, which they did live. But I didn't watch because it was while I was asleep, but that I've sort of watched a lot of and scrolled through. And it's a really great broadcast product. And it already has 102,000 views in 5 days.
Wow.
So, like, legit, legit amount of engagement. And you have to believe 95% of those people have maybe never even run a trail race or who are just sort of getting their feet wet in the sport. And Killian beat his course record in about 2.5 hours, women not far behind. So my point was going to be just like this being a good on ramp for people who are otherwise interested in watching the Olympics or the a big city marathon, something like that. It's packaged in a tight 2.5 hour, 3 hour broadcast. You don't have to watch the whole thing. You can also see the short form and medium form clips from it on their channel and others. And I just felt like it's a great top of funnel way to get more people into trail running because it was a really dramatic and competitive race. Killian won, but only by 4 seconds. And the women's race was similarly very entertaining. The person who won, it was her first ever race, a Kenyan, and she won Sierras and
Whoa.
all. A
Wow.
huge, huge deal. So good storylines that came out of it and packaged with a great professional broadcast in a tighter time window. It's not a 25-hour broadcast, right? It's 2.5 or 3 hours, and it's easier to scroll through than something like Western States or UTMB. And I just think this is great top of funnel stuff. People who will are absolutely never going to sign up for a 100-mile race, but who could be persuaded to sign up for a 17-mile trail race. Sierras and all, 102,000 views. I wonder how many of those people are going to be signing up for their first trail race as a result. So that's my BPC Golden Trail World Series YouTube channel this year is an all broadcast.
So cool. That's awesome, man. I feel like my entrance into ultra running, aside from you, was seeing an ultra running video on YouTube and being like, I can see myself doing that. It makes sense to me. It sort of unlocks it when you can see someone do it and you understand like what goes into it and stuff. So that's very cool. Well, my BPC is the closing ceremonies for the Olympics, and specifically, friend of the pod and our homie Kate Courtney with Tom Cruise. What?
No big deal.
No
We
big
have to
deal at
reiterate
all.
Kate's world championship bike jersey is just over your left shoulder right now,
That's right. That's
framed
right.
on your wall in the office for our audio listeners. You got to check us out on YouTube and you can see it for yourself.
Proudly framed. It's above the YouTube 100,000 play button and an Emmy. It's that high up on my list. So
That's a humble brag of humble brags right there.
Sorry. So the broadcast in France, Tom Cruise actually jumps off the top of the stadium, grabs the Olympic flag, and then it goes to this pre-recorded segment where he flies the Olympic flag to LA. So this is LA's first like big pop to announce, or to rally people for 2028. He skydives out of a plane with this backpack with the Olympic flag in it, and then he flips the Hollywood sign so the O's in the Hollywood become Olympic rings. And then he walks down and puts the Olympic flag in Kate's bike, high fives her, and then she rips down that hill. And then she actually gives the flag at the bottom of the hill to Michael Johnson, and then he goes off running with it. It's this relay to basically take the flag through LA, which is pretty special. And yeah, I was sort of shocked. I didn't know that any of this was happening, and so cool to see her involved. And she got to hang out with Tom Cruise, and then Tom Cruise posted about her. Cool that of all the sports that LA and the Olympics could have chosen, that they chose an outdoor sport to be kind of the first main one that Tom Cruise hands off to. And then you have track and field, obviously, and then it goes to skateboarding. So some of the newer kind of action sporty sports are being featured in the LA one, as opposed to some of the more traditional Olympic
Pretty
sports
cool.
being featured. So
Pretty cool. Mountain biking, running, skating being used as the relay. Although those are practical ways to travel, makes sense, but
fair.
also pretty cool to see our industry being featured for the 2028 Olympics. Tonight, we have a monthly group here, a couple of guys with some of my closest buddies who have kids about the same age as my son. We get together once a month for what we call Thursdads. We've got Thursdads tonight. And anyway, we're already plotting our taking our sons to LA 2028 together as a group of dads and boys. So you're free to join. You and Bennett got to come with us, Lucy.
I'm in. I'm
All
in.
right.
That would be going to the Olympics is definitely a bucket list for sure.
Yeah, the Olympics was great. I know we talked about it on a previous episode, but it was I think best Olympics in recent memory, certainly for me. So
Absolutely.
I'm already pumped up. They got to make it every 2 years, as I argued on last week's Bro Pod. Anyway, uh, well, Lucy, that was a great episode, man. I feel like I learned a lot from you. I feel like we had a great back and forth, and yeah, a great contribution from that DM on LinkedIn too. So,
Cool.
any,
Yeah, man. I'll meet you in Chamonix then, I guess.
all right, bro. Well, safe trip over there to Hawaii to our Second Nature audience. Don't worry, we got some great content coming next week. What's our interview on Tuesday?
Maris Jameson from Aura.
Maris Jameson from Aura, and we are going to be having Matt Sharkey on very soon. We got Kyle Frost pretty soon from Mountain Gazette. So a lot of good stuff coming up on Second Nature. Plus, your weekly Friday bro pods to send you into the weekend. Hope you enjoyed it. As usual, go check us out on all the platforms. LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, which we haven't mentioned enough. Go subscribe to our YouTube channel and also secondnature.media. Sign up for the newsletter. Big thanks for listening. Have an awesome weekend.